Welcome back, Honors. All right, so y'all did a great job today. I liked it a lot. Y'all made very, very nice little designs on my whiteboards and stuff because I just didn't really want to sit there and bark at y'all repeatedly about like aspects of Egyptian life, right? Really was digging like Avon's group on the calendar. Really digging really liking Delacour. Cameron was liking yours, and Colleen's work on like the roles of the Egyptian family and stuff, which we'll talk about all that stuff a little bit later, okay? But let's get back into like the history field of all this stuff, right? So we left off in the Middle Kingdom, right? And in the Middle Kingdom, we were talking about Senseret and the bureaucracy, Khufu and the Great Pyramids, Djoser, DJ Ozer's gnome, right? Like, and actually making gnomes throughout the entire province and kingdom of ancient Egypt, right? But then we're going to enter a period that is known as the Second Intermediate, right? And the Second Intermediate period is defined by the invasion, quote unquote, of these people known as the Hyksos, right? Hyksos, I say Hyksos a lot, right? But the Hyksos were a very, very important people to Egyptian history due to the fact that they all of a sudden just showed up and decided to start settling the Nile River Delta, right? So now a delta being the northern area, which we'll show you a map here in a second. Now the really, really intense thing about it is that the Egyptians just simply did not seem to be ready for it, mainly due to the fact that the Hyksos brought with them a lot of things that the Egyptians had never seen before, right? And it was kind of an unfair fight in a militaristic sense, right? So let's go ahead and move on over to this slideshow, right? And we're going to make sure, I'll make sure all these are available in a certain order and stuff, but excuse me. Now, when we were talking about the Second Intermediate period, you got to understand that the Hyksos people just kind of showed up, right? They were a not completely nomadic band of people, okay? So you had to, this is the hard part to understand about this particular era in history, right? Now, going from nomad to farmer is not a quick transition. It's something that takes hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? To learn to farm, to learn to settle, to learn to have crafts, to learn to wield metal, to learn to do all these things takes a long time. So it's not like the Hyksos went from being forager, hunter-gatherer, Homo sapiens sapiens of the pre-Paleolithic 8000 BC era, and then just showed up in Egypt and were like, whack, and took over, right? So the Hyksos, you have to understand, are a very big, important group that symbolize the movement of people over area, right? And the constant looking that people in ancient societies were to find fertile land, right? So the Hyksos did migrate. People moved a ton during the ancient time period, right? Some would refer to these people as barbarians. Some would refer to these people as just like invaders or outsiders. But the Hyksos were portrayed as a conquering horde by the Egyptians. And a lot of our documents that we actually have of ancient Egypt and actually like showing the arrival of the Hyksos, the Egyptians oftentimes refer to them as this like disgusting band horde of beggars and thieves that showed up in the Delta, started farming, and took over some of their major cities. More than likely, the Hyksos showed up, tried to settle the Delta, were probably attacked by the Egyptians, and the Hyksos used their superior intelligence to fight the Egyptians back, right? So this is the area that the Hyksos actually came into, right? All of this area in the blue right here is where they actually showed up, right? And the Hyksos took over the capital of Egypt, which was a very key thing, the capital of Memphis, right? And the Hyksos are actually going to end up setting up their own capital city in this area known as Avaris, right? Now, so this area of Egypt got carved out, right? And it was a really big negative for the ancient Egyptians because they now were kind of in the middle of like an enemy sandwich, right? So the big thing about it is the Egyptians are like the meat or the PB&J of this enemy sandwich, and they have two enemies on either side, right? The Hyksos were right here, and then the Kushite Nubians are down here, right? So the remaining influence of the Egyptians was completely under the control of the Hyksos people, right? And the Hyksos used their superior intelligence to take over this large area of ancient Egypt, right? And the Hyksos, speaking of their particular intelligence, they wielded certain things that they had never seen. Jot this down really quick next to Hyksos or underneath here. They had bronze tools and weapons, right? So bronze is the combination of copper and tin, and we're going to bring this up again when we get into Greece. But this is this alloy is super important. because bronze is better than copper, which is what the Egyptians were using for their weapons, right? So some of you are like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, like, what are you talking about? Why is this alloy of bronze and tin better than just, or why is this alloy of copper and tin, which makes bronze, better than just a copper weapon, right? And I would say to you that is a phenomenal question, Jenna Hasselbeck. The big thing about it is copper does not hold an edge for as long, and it's softer. When you mix tin in with copper, it makes it harder, and it makes it hold a sharp edge for longer. So the Hyksos showed up with these bronze tools, and the Egyptians didn't stand a chance. If you bang a bronze or a copper like sword into a bronze one, the copper one will dent and sometimes likely break, right? So the Hyksos also showed up with the very first models of chariots that anybody had ever seen, pulled by an animal the Egyptians had never seen, a horse, right? So like they had horses, chariots, and they also had another very important thing. This thing known as a composite bow, right? A composite bow and arrow, which had animal sinew, tissue, and bones that actually made it more flexible and could fire an arrow much further, much faster without breaking, right? So the Hyksos just outmatched them. But here's the key thing. Mr. Terry's favorite historical term, cultural diffusion, right? When cultures spread through war and trade, right? So when the Egyptians got attacked by the Hyksos, you got to understand the Egyptians are going to be like, oh, what are these weapons I've never seen? Oh, what are those animals I've never seen? What's that chariot thing? How do they use that? They're going to start learning how to use it while they're under Hyksos occupation, right? So a lot of these ideas are going to rub off on the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are going to learn how to make composite bows and bronze tools and large breed animals and other things like that. And you got to remember, there are more Egyptians in Egypt than there are Hyksos that showed up. So what ends up happening is the Egyptians in the New Kingdom period expel the Hyksos, right? That is the biggest part about the New Kingdom period, right? Another period of prosperity, because the 18th dynasty is considered the one that actually encouraged the Egyptians to rise up in rebellion and push the Hyksos out and retake their homeland using the tools that they learned how to make from the Hyksos people, right? So they conquered Nubia as well beneath them, because remember, they were in that enemy sandwich. And so this also brought Egypt to its absolute height, right? So this was also the height of what is known as Egyptian imperialism, right? So as you can see, Egypt expelled those Hyksos, bringing in the New Kingdom period, right? So speaking up this whole thing, though, the Egyptians are not going to stop there. They're now going to use these bronze tools, these weapons, these things that no one's ever seen before, and they're going to create an imperial state, right? So now this is where we start getting into this like Exodus discussion, right? We're not really sure. So imperialism is when one country or civilization takes over the area or country of another, right? So imperialism would be like if we decided to go and take over Mount Carmel, right? We took it over, but we allowed the girls that go to school there to still go to school there, but anything good that comes out of that school goes to us first, right? That's imperialism. When one country or civilization subdues or takes control of another one for their resources, right? The positives of imperialism for Egypt is it made them a ton of money. The negative of it is it did encourage widespread slavery from conquering other people. Now, this is where we get into this wishy-washy Exodus thing, right? Because if you look at this map back here, they did actually take over and imperialize what you know as modern-day Israel, right? So there's a chance that the Israel people or the Canaanites were under the control of Egyptians at one point, right? Now, they could have been Hyksos that broke off and went over there and like founded an area in Canaan. They could have been, like, we don't really know, but the problem is that historians believe that the story of the Exodus, which is the Jews leaving Egypt directly with Moses, would have happened during this time period during the New Kingdom, but there's no evidence of it, so we're not really sure, right? So it's one of these things that's kind of like the best account of it we have is in the Bible due to the fact that we can't find any records of it in Egypt, right? Which some historians kind of argue the idea it might be a parable. It could be an example of, like, it could be the expulsion of the Hyksos. It could be Egyptian imperialism. We're just not really sure, right? So the big thing going forward, though, is you begin to see a growth in Egyptian art, in Egyptian culture, in Egyptian wealth, right? When you start seeing tombs being created during this particular kingdom, you're seeing kings being buried with golden headdresses in golden sarcophagus, outlined with precious stones, having honey actually embalmed with them that you could actually still eat when they found it, because honey never actually technically goes bad. But like the domestication of bees, the expansion of agriculture, you're seeing the New Kingdom period as the most prosperous period, right? And you're seeing their architecture grow. These right here are the monuments to Ramses, right? Look how large these architectural pieces are that are carved into this mountainside compared to this person, right? The Temple of Ramses, right? Look at the growth of religious temples where they're starting to use these column things that they actually invented first, not the Greeks, right? And then also you're just seeing the growth of ruling power, right? And the growth of the Egyptian culture. Now, the big thing going forward, though, is the New Kingdom is also home to this weird little thing that happened that no one ever saw. So everyone, and when I teach it to the regular, the academic classes, right, you always hear that the Hebrews were the very first people to create a monotheistic religion. So ironically enough, they weren't. So you just kind of explain that it's the first one to be created that actually endured, where that actually isn't necessarily, well, it's sort of true. So the big thing about it is these two people, Akhenaten and Nefertiti, actually created the very first monotheistic faith in ancient Egypt, which is, again, another really weird, interesting thing. Because, like, we were talking about, like, cultural diffusion. So what if, hypothetically, they did take over the Jewish people, and maybe they, like, the Exodus happened, and maybe they believed that this monotheistic idea of one ruling God was the way to go, right? And the way, what they called them is Aton or Aten, right? So they literally believed that there was now one God, and it was this one sun God. And they kind of threw out all the mythology stuff that we talked about at the very beginning of this, right? They were like, Osiris, no more. Horus, no more. Anubis doesn't exist. And the problem with this that happened is that Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten, it's not going to last for very long. Now, the one cool thing about it is they did try to introduce monotheism to Egypt, right? And it is kind of neat because they are the parents of King Tut, right? Well, Akhenaten is his father, right? Nefertiti is not his mom. Nefertiti and Akhenaten were brother and sister, and she couldn't have kids anymore, so he went off and had a child with his like sister, known as the Younger Lady. We don't really know who she is or what her name is, but we do know where her mummy is, and we've actually seen her body as well. But that is Tut's real mom, even though Nefertiti claims that she was like his mother, right? So Nefertiti, interesting enough, also in this ruling dynamic, though, did have the exact same like ruling amount of power as her husband did. And even after their death, though, like they were revered as decent rulers, but Egypt did switch back and denounce like their faith like immediately, right? Because check this out, King Tut, when he was originally born, right here, there is Nefertiti, and there is Akhenaten, and there is Nefertiti right there, and you can actually see the two of them together with their children, and that we believe possibly could be King Tut himself, Nefertiti's stepson, and then Akhenaten's real child. Now, when they had King Tut originally, they named him Tutankhaten, right? T-U-T, Tutankhaten, right? Named after their new god, Aten, right? Because that's where Akhenaten's name comes from. The A-T-A-N means like of this new god, this new one monotheistic faith. Well, King Tut, after his parents both died, he kind of dispatched that entire faith. It was like, no, we're going back. And they went back to like Amun-Ra, Horus, and all the old gods that they used to have. And so he renamed himself to Tutankhamun, right? Amun as in Amun-Ra, Tutankhamun, right? So like, it's a very interesting little story. Now, and then also some people believe that that's why King Tut might have been murdered by priests. All right, but we don't really know, but we do know that there's a big mark in the back of Tut's mummy that actually shows that he might have been beaten to death. But King Tut also had a little really jacked up leg and all this other stuff. But the New Kingdom is a really important time period because of that introduction of monotheism. Even for a second, the monotheism was introduced. It's still a very important period. And also the growth of their imperialism, right? And the growth of their wealth and their influence. Now, but then, yeah, everything comes to an end. All right, so like the third intermediate does occur, right? And that's when the Hittites show up. Stupid Hittites. All right, the Hittites ruin stuff for a lot of people. The Hittites didn't save Troy from being destroyed. The Hittites kind of show up and take over all of Egypt at one point. The Hittites lead to actually one really important thing later on, but we'll get there. Now, but the big thing is the Hittites show up and they invade Egypt, causing massive political fragmentation, right? And Egypt began to crumble under the pressure of these new invaders, right? And Egypt would eventually push the Hittites out, but not soon enough, because then following their trying to reconstruct themselves, that's when Alexander the Great and the Greeks show up and they end up taking over Egypt later on, right? So the third intermediate period is kind of the last era of the Egyptian historical log, right? And tomorrow we're going to end up talking about, some of the important stuff when it comes to when it comes to Egyptian society that have lingered with us, like little kind of things about their lifestyles and stuff like that. But it's a really interesting kind of thing to understand that, again, the Egyptians were bested by, this is also a water jug from the Hittites. It's really, really gross. Look at that. Like, that's the handle, and these are, like, where the water comes out, and that's a nose. It's supposed to be, like, two giant mouths going, oh. So, and then this is, like, a Hittite religious relic. This is the really interesting thing, though, because yet again, the Egyptians were bested by someone with superior metal, right? So the Hittites were a part of this thing that we'll talk about later called the Bronze Age collapse. But they also were the first people to start using iron in a widespread manner, right? And they kind of also begin the Iron Age, right? So, but that's where we're going to leave it off, right? And then we're going to talk more. Oh, wait, no, this is what we need. Sorry. The lasting impact, right? So there we go. Now, even though cultural diffusion did boom during these invasions and wars, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the early Greeks, everybody's going to start coming into contact with each other during this like new kingdom era. And the Hittites are going to develop ironworking, leaving their mark on history. And just like Egypt with its political bureaucracy and Mesopotamia with its writing system and codes of law, these two major civilizations, particularly Mesopotamia and Egypt of what we're talking about, left a massive impact on Western civilization because they invented the first systems of writing and irrigation and mummification and polytheistic religious structure and bureaucracies and political centralism and like all these major, major important things, right? So I will talk to you guys later. Go ahead and hit pause and just jot the rest of this down, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on. And remember, you have a geography quiz coming up next class, and then following that class period, we are going to be having a quiz on Mesopotamia and Egypt, okay? But we'll talk about that next class as well, and we'll get everybody squared away and scheduled. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.